Whoever doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants it back has no brain. It seems that Putin has forgotten his own words with the launch of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and an intensity of fighting not seen since the Second World War. As we speak, Russian forces are penetrating deep into the country, and bombs are falling on major Ukrainian cities, resulting in mass casualties and a wave of millions of refugees. Yet Russia has not remained unscathed. In the wake of the invasion, the Russian stock market fell by 50%, the currency has collapsed, and the West has unleashed the toughest sanctions yet, and Russia has lost all international legitimacy. In this video, we'll argue that even as Russian tanks roll into Ukrainian cities, Russia has already lost the political and economic battle, and on multiple fronts, from the economy to energy to military, the long-term consequences of this hostile and illegal invasion will backfire on Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin. Find out how in this video. If you enjoyed this content, hit that subscribe button as well as the bell notification for more. Sanctions. In my last video, I tried to explore possible solutions to the Ukraine conflict, focusing on Finlandization or the establishment of a neutral Ukraine in exchange for a restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. That solution has now gone out of the window with Putin's invasion. In the video, I had assumed incorrectly that a full-scale invasion was unlikely because it would be irrational and inflict far more costs on Russia than benefits. Russia could gain far more in terms of increased energy prices and negotiating power by threatening to invade rather than actually invading. This perspective was shared by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who stated that a Russian invasion was unlikely just 2 weeks before it happened. That perspective turned out to be wrong. But what wasn't wrong was my analysis that a Russian invasion will hurt Russia far more than it would help Russia. As we speak, the United States, the EU, the UK and other powers have unleashed a devastating package of sanctions that will likely cripple the Russian economy. Initial sanctions include banning Russian planes from European airspace, shutting down Russian state media outlets in the EU, a ban on golden passports that allowed countries like Cyprus to sell citizenship to wealthy Russians who would then stash their wealth abroad, and personal sanctions on key Russian oligarchs as well as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Putin himself. But the worst sanctions have been financial. In an unprecedented move, Western powers have agreed to cut off several major Russian banks from SWIFT. SWIFT is what banks all around the world use to facilitate transactions between each other. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT cuts off Russian banks from the international financial system, making it extremely difficult and expensive to do financial transactions with Russia. In the past, only nations such as Venezuela, North Korea, and Iran have been cut off from SWIFT, with devastating economic consequences. However, Russia was prepared for this measure, amassing $630 billion in foreign exchange reserves that it would use to prop up its currency, bail out the banks, and weather the storm. But then, the West went nuclear. The single worst sanction has been the West's decision to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank that are denominated in Western currencies or held in Western banks. You see, of the $630 billion in foreign reserves, 23% is held in Russia and 14% in China. This part is immune to sanctions and can be used to smooth over the economic devastation caused by sanctions. But 53% of Russia's foreign reserves are held in Western countries, and these assets have now been frozen. In other words, Russia will no longer have access to the majority of its financial safety net. These reserves could have been used to bail out the Russian banks affected by the cutoff from SWIFT, but that is no longer possible. This means that the Russian financial system will implode and Russia will slide into economic depression. As a result of these sanctions, the Russian ruble has lost 40% of its value. The stock market crashed by 50%, major companies are fleeing the country, and ordinary Russians are making a run for the banks. Total financial crisis. Russia has tried to stop a run on the banks by imposing capital controls and foreign exchange controls so people can't move their money out of the country and they have to give up any foreign currency they have. They've also raised interest rates from 10 to 20% to stop inflation. But these measures will not stop the mass inflation that is coming. Besides the EU and the US, Norway has stated that its sovereign wealth fund will divest from its $2.83 billion worth of assets in Russia, while neutral Switzerland will freeze Russian assets. Putin's attempted invasion of Ukraine will bankrupt his country. These measures will unfortunately also hurt Europe and the rest of the world. The EU's $220 billion in trade with Russia will be negatively affected, and the billions in Russian assets owned by EU companies are vulnerable to confiscation with Putin's counter-sanctions. On top of that, Ukraine and Russia produce 29% of the world's grain, and Russia is the world's third largest oil producer. So food and energy prices will go up, worsening the current inflation. Sanctions historically have been incredibly effective at destroying a country's economy, but not very effective at changing the behavior of its leaders. Sanctions against Iraq in the 90s reduced Iraq's GDP by 50%, but had no effect on Saddam Hussein. But that is not necessarily the goal here. The Russian military-industrial complex is supported by the Russian economy. Therefore, we must target the Russian economy in order to undermine the Russian military-industrial complex and its war-making capabilities. And that also applies to the Russian energy sector. Even under the current sanctions, Russia can continue to export oil and gas to Europe, its most important source of revenue. But that won't last. Energy giant no more. Russia is the world's third largest oil producer and the world's second largest gas producer. In the wake of the Russian invasion, oil prices have surged to $115 a barrel, the highest since 2014, and European gas prices have jumped by 62%. While the short-term impact of the invasion will bring windfall profits to Russian energy giants Rosneft and Gazprom, the long-term economic impact on the Russian energy industry will be devastating. Europe depends on Russia for 40% of its gas supplies and 25% of its oil. And until now, Russia has been able to use that as leverage in negotiations and to deter Western intervention. It is for this reason that Germany was soft on Russia and refused to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because of its dependency on Russian gas. But in the wake of the Russian invasion, Germany has had no choice but to cancel Nord Stream 2. On top of that, European countries are now being forced to search for alternatives to Russian gas. Because Russia has demonstrated its unreliability as an international partner, European countries, unlike before the invasion, are now prepared to undergo the politically unpopular, short-term costs of surging energy prices and inflation in order to end their dependence on Russian gas and search for other sources from places like Qatar, Azerbaijan, Algeria, and the United States. This will not happen in one day, or 1 month, or even 1 year, but over the next few years. By invading Ukraine, Russia has jeopardized the long-term security of its energy market and therefore jeopardized both the foundation of the Russian economy and the foundation of Putin's power. You see, oil and gas provide 40% of Russia's government budget and 60% of its exports. In other words, Russia is a petro-state. In the wake of the invasion, Germany has announced the construction of new LNG terminals to import gas from elsewhere, and BP has dumped its 20% stake in the Russian oil company Rosneft. Even though no sanctions have been placed on the oil and gas industry yet, increasingly many companies are acting as if those sanctions are already in place, divesting from the Russian energy market. The decline of Russian energy exports to Europe in the coming years will undermine the ability of the Russian government to support its military and pay out the pensions and subsidies that have pacified the population till now. Keep in mind, the most widespread protests against Putin till now and the most serious drop in his approval ratings occurred in 2018 when he tried to raise the pension age and cut pensions. If Russia loses energy revenues, the payout of pensions and other social welfare programs will become increasingly difficult, leading to increased social unrest. On top of that, also at the elite level, Putin will lose support. Putin's power depends on key oligarchs who control major stakes in the oil and gas sector. If these sectors go into decline as a result of Putin's reckless foreign policy, his position will become more tenuous and the oligarchs may start plotting to replace him. Russia cannot compensate for the loss in European energy revenues with increased exports to China. Increasing gas exports to China would require building new gas pipelines, which would cost billions of dollars and take years, while China will likely pay less than Europe due to its greater leverage in that situation. It is for this reason that undermining Russia's energy monopoly will be key to undermining its invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian Resistance. By all indications, the Russian plan of attack rested on the idea that Russian forces would perform a lightning strike and knock out major Ukrainian resistance within 48 hours, forcing the government to flee Kiev and agree to a negotiated settlement on Russia's terms, likely installing a puppet government in the process. Russia expected that the Ukrainian military would fold in much the same way that Iraq's military collapsed in the wake of the American invasion. That turned out not to be the case. Russia is encountering unexpected levels of resistance and unanticipated losses in the face of the Ukrainian determination to fight. Ukrainian morale is soaring, with 91% of the people supporting the actions of President Volodymyr Zelensky. Russia failed to take any major Ukrainian cities until a week into the invasion and failed to collapse the government. As the invasion gets bogged down, the Russian army is facing massive logistical issues and is clearly unprepared for a long, protracted conflict. While Russia still has overwhelming military superiority, it's clear that this conflict will not end in a matter of days, as Putin had hoped, but will be long and drawn out, drawing Russia into a costly and difficult war, much like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan back in the 80s. Russia has spent an estimated $7 billion in the first 5 days of the invasion, and some estimates suggest that it could be spending even up to $20 billion a day. Even if it's only half of that, every day that the Ukrainians hold on, Russia comes closer to bankruptcy. The fact that Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons just 4 days after invading a vastly weaker country is further evidence that the Russian invasion is stalling and that Putin is growing desperate. You don't threaten with nukes if you are about to win the war. Now that the war appears to be drawing out, we can expect that Putin will unleash untold brutality on Ukraine, including bombing of civilian targets, the use of illegal cluster bombs, and the leveling of whole cities, in much the same way that the Russians did in Chechnya. Kiev will be the next Aleppo. Kharkiv will be the next Grozny. Putin has also failed in his political objectives. In my last video, I explained that one of Putin's key goals was preventing Ukraine's turn to the West by stopping its membership of NATO and the European Union. Yet since the invasion, Ukraine has formally sent in its application for EU membership, and the presidents of 8 EU countries have called for immediate talks on Ukrainian membership. As a result of Putin's actions, Ukraine's turn to the West is now inevitable. Putin's actions have also destroyed any and all soft power that the Russians had in Ukraine. Before 2014, pro-Russian candidates could count on anywhere between 35 and 40% of the vote, and there was a reasonable chance that a pro-Russian candidate could win every other election cycle. That's how Viktor Yanukovych won in 2010. But by illegally annexing Crimea, funding rebels in the Donbass, and now launching a full-scale invasion of the country, Putin has destroyed any pro-Russian voting bloc that might have existed. Nations are built on stories. The Ukrainian nation will now be built on stories of a president who refused to flee the capital, of soldiers on Snake Island who said to a Russian warship and lived to tell the tale, and of civilians stopping tanks with their bare hands. 2022 has brought about a rebirth of the Ukrainian nation, and it has been reborn as a nation defined in opposition to Russia, thanks to Putin. NATO Expansion. One of Putin's key goals was preventing NATO expansion up to Russia's borders, which is why he illegally occupied Crimea and the Donbass. As long as Ukraine has a territorial dispute, it can't join NATO. Yet by choosing to occupy the whole country, Putin's policy has spectacularly backfired. As of the invasion, Sweden and Finland are reconsidering to join NATO, with a majority of Finns and a plurality of Swedes now in favor of NATO membership. In response, Russia has threatened with military consequences if this happens. Yet both nations have rejected Russian threats. Meanwhile, Kosovo has asked the United States to establish a permanent military base in the country and speed up its integration into NATO. In a twist of irony, Russian aggression meant to stop countries from joining NATO has only succeeded in facilitating NATO expansion. As a result of the invasion, Chancellor Scholz has announced that he will triple German military spending to $100 billion for this year and increase military spending in the coming years to the NATO 2% requirement. This represents the greatest rearmament of the German military since the Second World War, thanks to Putin. NATO member states have also continued to supply massive amounts of military aid to Ukraine, and Turkey has closed the Bosphorus Strait to Russian warships, effectively imposing a naval blockade on Russian forces in the Black Sea. Internationally, Russia also continues to lose support. Kazakhstan, a Russian ally, where Putin had deployed troops in January 2022 to suppress protests against its dictator, has refused to recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and refused to send troops to Ukraine, despite being a member of the CSTO, the Russian version of NATO. The United States General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to condemn Russia, with 141 voting in favor, 35 abstaining, and only 5, including Russia, voting against. Russia has lost all international legitimacy and has facilitated the unification, expansion, and remilitarization of NATO within the space of a week. Dependency. With precious few allies and the decline of trade with the EU, Russia will have no choice but to turn to its partner, China. But this will not be an equal partnership. Russia needs China far more than China needs Russia. The Russian economy is smaller than Italy's, with China's economy being almost 10 times larger. The trade relationship will be fundamentally unequal. Russia will primarily export raw materials such as oil, gas, and minerals to China in exchange for Chinese manufactured goods, a relationship more similar to China's relationship with African countries than with the EU or the United States. It's also clear that the closer economic relationship with China will not be able to fully compensate for lost trade with the European Union. Russia's trade with the EU amounts to over $220 billion, while its trade with China is just $146 billion. It would take years before Russia could fully substitute lost EU trade for increased Chinese trade. The same goes for finance. Russia has been cut off from SWIFT, but there are alternatives. China has a version of SWIFT called KIPS, but this is only in limited use and would only facilitate transactions between Russia and China, not the rest of the world. On top of that, China's efforts to help Russia financially will be limited because China fears secondary sanctions. For this reason, China has restricted the ability of state-owned banks to finance Russian commodities, which has caused Chinese banks to stop giving loans to Russia. China is not willing to destabilize its own economy to help Russia. As for its foreign reserves, most of Russia's remaining foreign reserves that are not in Russia or frozen in Western countries are in China. With this increasing dependency, China will have more and more leverage over Russia and be able to extract more and more concessions from Russia. For instance, China has relied on Russia for the import of advanced military technology, thereby enriching Russia's military-industrial complex. But with increased dependency on Beijing, China will pressure Russia to hand over key military technologies. Without any other options, on many fronts, Russia will be forced to accept China's demands. The Fall of Putin. In the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, his approval ratings have surged from 61% to 69%, according to independent polling by the Levada Center. This is a much smaller jump than when Putin annexed Crimea, and his approval ratings went from 69% to 82%. It also has to be said that this poll was conducted in the context of a Russia where it is illegal to even call the invasion an invasion, and all independent media has been suppressed. Therefore, it's not surprising that 50% of Russians see the West as the aggressor in this conflict, and 50% say military intervention is justified to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. Regardless, what we are seeing is the result of a temporary rally around the flag effect. We saw a similar spike in Bush's approval ratings after he led his country into wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the wake of 9/11. But this will not last. Protests against Putin's invasion have already broken out in major cities despite the authoritarian crackdown. As the war takes its toll, opposition to the invasion will grow. For now, any economic pain resulting from the sanctions will likely be blamed on the West, not on Putin. But as the economic toll of sanctions will force Russia to cut pensions and other social programs, this could change. When Putin tried to do this in 2018, mass protests broke out and his approval ratings collapsed. But more than economics, as the dead bodies of Russian soldiers begin to come home, support for the war, and by extension for Putin, will decline. All this is a recipe for increased social unrest. But revolutions don't succeed without support from some sections of the elite. Russian oligarchs are turning on Putin. As a result of the sanctions, 22 Russian billionaires lost $39 billion in the space of 24 hours, and they will no longer have access to the $800 billion in assets that they have in Western countries, or fancy holidays to London and Paris. Yachts owned by Russian oligarchs have been seized across Europe. It is this elite who keeps Putin in power, and already cracks are beginning to show. The head of Russia's UN delegation for climate change apologized for Russia's invasion and stated that there was no justification for it, in an act of defiance against Putin. Putin's own advisor has also spoken out against the invasion. But more importantly, 2 Russian oligarchs have already spoken out against the war publicly, while another has done so anonymously. As the Russian elite continues to personally experience negative consequences from the war, they will begin to question Putin's leadership. Putin's irrational invasion of Ukraine is further evidence of why democracy in Russia is necessary. It is precisely the lack of democratic checks and balances in Russia that failed to stop Putin from arbitrarily starting an illegal war. Even in the Soviet Union, post-Stalin, decisions were not made by one man, but collectively by the Politburo. Even Russia's corrupt oligarchs may begin to see the usefulness of having a leader who is reined in by checks and balances. While it still remains unlikely that Putin will be removed from power, indeed, he has struck fear into the hearts of his underlings. For the first time in decades, there is a non-zero chance of Putin getting overthrown. While it still remains likely he stays in power, his legitimacy within Russia is declining. Putin will crack down more heavily and more directly in order to secure his position. He won't even pretend that he's not a dictator. All of Putin's geopolitical goals in Ukraine, including stopping NATO expansion and keeping Ukraine in Russia's sphere of influence, have been undermined by Putin's invasion of the country. As a consequence, Russia will now become a pariah state, no different from Venezuela, Iran, or North Korea. Putin's invasion of Ukraine will bankrupt the country and destroy the wealth of its oligarchs, while guaranteeing that it gets bogged down in a bloody, brutal, and pointless war. This is the last gasp of a dying empire and a tin-pot dictator. But even so, a cornered dog fights hardest. To find out what a negotiated solution to the Ukraine conflict could have looked like, watch this video. Consider donating to Ukrainian humanitarian relief efforts in the link below. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons, including Matthias, Linda, Richard, Eisenskjold, and many more for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.